Like all school children in India over the last 170-odd years, I was familiar with the noble face of RamMohun Roy peering out of my history books, and associated his name with the abolition of sati, the practice of widows burning themselves on the funeral pyres of their husbands. I vaguely knew that he had died in Bristol. My interest was stirred when, in connection with my day job in software development, I was sent to England on an extended assignment to the Berkshire town of Bracknell. But I knew precious little about RamMohun the man and the circumstances of his last days in this country. Fortunately, Bristol was only about 80 miles on the M4 from where I was, and one day I set out to see his tomb in Arna's Vale.
Outside us smiling, inside us screaming out loud. Oh, I'm going back to where the beach is.
On the same day I met an Englishwoman named Carla Contractor, whose knowledge of RamMohun and devotion to his cause would put most Indians to shame. With her help and my personal research, I learned fascinating details of RamMohun's last few weeks in Bristol and the profound impact he had on the people around him during his very short stay there. Soon he was more than just a historical figure to me, and I started to appreciate the enormity of his achievements amidst tremendous personal tribulations. Born in the village of Radhanagar in Bengal in 1772, RamMohun had prepared for a career in the Mughal courts by studying Arabic and Persian, following in the footsteps of his forefathers. As a Hindu Brahmin, he had also acquired proficiency in Sanskrit, the classical language of the Vedas, and his mother tongue, Bengali. He had read the Hindu Shastras as well as the Quran in the original. At the tender age of 16, he had already begun to question the superstitions and idolatry of the Hindus as aberrations from the teachings of the Vedanta, much to the consternation of his orthodox and ritualistic parents. The real turning point came circa April 1811, when he witnessed the Rite of Sati being performed by Alok Manjari, one of the wives of his deceased elder brother, Jagannath. The grief-stricken woman had chosen to follow the ancient practice of immolating herself on the pyre of her deceased husband, and RamMohun's efforts to dissuade her had failed. While in theory the act was voluntary, there was no way for a woman to reverse her decision. RamMohun, nearly 40 years old, was a witness as his sister-in-law, close to himself in age, shrieked in mortal fear, her courage having abandoned her as the flames engulfed her body. He watched in dismay as family members held her down with long bamboo poles, and a cacophony of drums drowned out her pleas for help. RamMohun vowed not to rest till this barbaric practice was abolished. While by nature courteous and polite to a fault, he displayed remarkable steadfastness in his core convictions. The rest of his life was chiefly devoted to a campaign to end sati, though he somehow managed to be prolific in many other areas as well. Simultaneously, he managed to learn other languages, including English, and was the first Indian to constructively engage with the British rulers of the day for the betterment of his lot. He amassed a great fortune in trading with the East India Company that he disbursed generously for philanthropic purposes. He helped David Hare set up the Hindu school, later to become Presidency College, one of the finest centers of learning in India. Students now learned English, mathematics and the sciences, along with what was virtuous and true in the Indian tradition. He was also instrumental in setting up a free press in India, publishing in several languages, a tradition that lives on today, forming the bulwark of the most populous democracy in the world. Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, a former President of India, aptly called RamMohun the father of modern India. On the 4th of July 1829, RamMohun's long-cherished dream was nearly fulfilled. The government of Bengal, under the orders of Governor-General William Bentinck, passed a law to abolish the practice of sati throughout India. The East India Company, hitherto reluctant to interfere in the religion of the Hindus, out of fear that its commercial interests would suffer in a resulting unrest, was convinced by the erudite arguments put forth by RamMohun that the practice of sati had no basis in the scriptures. Nevertheless, RamMohun's opponents, themselves influential citizens, took the extraordinary step of engaging an English lawyer to represent their case to the Privy Council in London, claiming sati to be integral to their faith and seeking to resurrect the practice. RamMohun was widely attacked and ridiculed, and his personal safety was also at stake. Undaunted, he decided to travel to England himself to appear before the Privy Council, determined to ensure an irrevocable end to sati. It was opportune that the Mughal Emperor of Delhi, Akbar Shah II, conferred upon him the honorary title of a Rajah and found reason to commission his voyage.
I wanted to obtain, by personal observation, a more thorough insight into the manners, customs, religion, and political institutions of Europe. I refrained, however, from carrying this intention into effect until the friends who coincided in my sentiments should be increased in number and strength. My expectations having been at length realized, in November 1830, I embarked for England as the discussion of the East India Company's charter was expected to come on, by which the treatment of the natives of India and its future government would be determined for many years to come. And an appeal to the King in Council against the abolition of the practice of burning Hindu widows was to be heard before the Privy Council. And His Majesty, the Emperor of Delhi, had likewise commissioned me to bring before the authorities in England certain encroachments on his rights by the East India Company. I accordingly arrived in England in April 1831.
For 2 years he was a guest at the house of John and Joseph Hare, brothers of David Hare of Calcutta, at 48 Bedford Square in the Bloomsbury district of London. Even though the East India Company refused to accept him as such, he became in fact the first Indian ambassador to Britain and was seated among the diplomats at the coronation of William IV and at the inauguration of the London Bridge. The Rajah was buried on the grounds of a private residence following his death in 1833. Cremation, the usual Hindu custom to dispose of the dead, would not be legal in England for another 50 years. His lead coffin was then reinterred at Vale at the behest of his friend Rabindranath Tagore 10 years later, a topic to which we shall return in more detail. In our times, this cemetery had fallen into disrepair and had got terribly overgrown. In 2001, as it was no longer profitable, the owner, Tony Towner, had decided to close it and sell it off for development. This would mean that the remains of those buried, including RamMohun Roy, would have to be moved elsewhere by their relatives or face destruction. There was a public outcry at this announcement, and a group of volunteers, backed by the Bristol Evening Post, ensured that the gates remained open. A compulsory purchase order was finally won by the City Council on the 7th of August 2003, allowing it to take possession of the cemetery. Its restoration is now in the hands of a voluntary organisation called the Friends of Arnos Vale, of which Calcutta Contractor is a prominent and enthusiastic member.
Welcome to Arnos Vale Cemetery. Here there are 45 acres, very heavily filled with graves. It was bought as the Bristol General Cemetery Company and set up as a private cemetery after the graveyards in the city churches were filled to overflowing as a result of the late Georgian cholera, typhoid and other epidemics. There literally was no room for the dead of the city to be buried, and a series of cemeteries, public cemeteries, were opened throughout Britain at that time, and this was one of the earliest of them. 45 acres has a wonderful variety of monumental masonry, tombs, including the Rajahs, of course. All the way throughout the cemetery, I've been recording the names of people who worked in India. And on the left, there are several Indian officers, people who worked in the ICS or in the East India Company before 1857. The building on the left now is the crematorium, which is defunct, and the one just we're looking at now is the nonconformist chapel. This cemetery was divided into two parts, the Anglican and the nonconformist. And the nonconformist ground, which we're driving through now, of course was non-consecrated. So the Rajah, whose tomb is just coming up on our left, was buried, one of the very first burials, in non-consecrated ground. Of course it was a reinterment, and he didn't particularly wish to go into a cemetery anyway. But when Dwarkanath came to London, he came to Bristol and arranged for the tomb to be designed by William Prinsep, an old friend in Calcutta of the British trading family. He decided that the tomb must be moved here, and so Rajah was reinterred from Stapleton Grove to here. We're off to Stapleton, along the Bath Road, and I'll take you past Lewins Mead, so you can see the route that the Rajah will have taken.
Wonderful.
Of course, the houses that are along the route are early and late Victorian, so it would have been open country in the Rajah's day, but I can't put the clock back and show you it as it must have been 170 odd years ago.
I have to imagine, I guess.
You have to imagine green fields, peasants and cows. Mary Carpenter was about 25 years old when RamMohun Roy came to Bristol, and she was a very quiet, shy woman. She didn't say very much, but she was absolutely entranced with the Rajah, and continued to think about him and his work and what he had meant. She was convinced that he had become a Unitarian. He hadn't, but that was her impression of it. She continued to believe that, but in her case it led her on to a lot of interesting contacts, and she was to go out to India 4 times when she was over 60 years old, and she was to write The Last Days in England of Rajah RamMohun Roy.
While Mary Carpenter, like many other Unitarians, might have mistaken the Rajah's deep admiration of the Christian faith as his adoption of that religion, she could hardly be faulted for it. His vision of a universal religion was not only ahead of its time in Georgian England, but very much remains so in the 21st century. Far from having achieved the harmonious understanding of faiths that the Rajah had hoped for, we wake up every morning to the news of unspeakable atrocities committed in the name of religion. Even the Rajah's closest friends, such as Dwarkanath Tagore and Lant Carpenter, could not fully identify with his theological position. At some level, therefore, the Rajah was quite alone, a sentiment that is echoed in a song that he composed in England. Apart from this minor limitation, however, Mary Carpenter provides a vivid and original account of the Rajah's stay in Bristol. While the Rajah and his retinue were residing in the mansion owned by Catherine Castle, he used to travel about 6 miles every day to visit Reverend Land Carpenter, whose invitation had brought him to Bristol.
Private driveway, which used to be the carriageway to Stapleton Grove, which became Beach House. The house itself is on the right, a beautiful Georgian building, which has recently been converted into flats. The room in which the Rajah died is on the first floor, the second from the right. The front of the house has got a most beautiful garden. On the house itself there is a plaque placed by the Brahma Samaj recording the fact that RamMohun Roy lived here, and round the corner where we are going there is a RamMohun Roy Walk, which has been named by the developer of this area, because it's full of modern houses now, after the great reformer.
Remarkably, RamMohun had succeeded in all the tasks that he had set before himself. However, it was not until July of 1832 that Sati was finally and permanently banned. By this time, his agency Mackintosh and Company had failed, and his money was held up in Calcutta. Never before a recipient of charity, he had now become embarrassed for money. Following a trip to France to witness the workings of the post-revolutionary government under Louis Philippe, and at the end of his rope, the Rajah finally arrived in Bristol to catch a respite. This recently discovered portrait by the American painter Rembrandt Peale, finished exactly 40 days before RamMohun's death, gives us an idea of how the beleaguered Rajah had aged when he arrived in Bristol. Within 3 weeks of his arrival, the Rajah died following a short illness. His constant worries about money and the risk of his family being ostracized due to his progressive ideas, together with the unending stream of visitors, left him exhausted. The rest he needed was foregone, perhaps serving to shorten his days. Heading back from Stapleton, we turned into Great George Street in the heart of Bristol. Number 2 Great George Street, renumbered as 3 after the war, as the area was rebuilt after heavy German bombing. In this house, provided by his congregation, Land Carpenter and his family ran a school.
This is the house of Land Carpenter, where he lived with his wife and his children. Land Carpenter was the minister that Rajah RamMohun Roy had come to visit here in Bristol, the Unitarian minister, and he had a manse, that is, the meeting, the organisation, the community, had given this particular house for the minister to live in. It was a very large house, and in it Land Carpenter first ran a school for boys, a boarding school, and then later on he was subject to depression and not a very strong man. His wife and his daughter Mary ran a girls' school. Behind is a Waterloo Church, which was built to commemorate the British victory at the Battle of Waterloo, and that must have been the view that Mary Carpenter and the Rajah had from the drawing room, the first floor drawing room of this house, number 3 Great George Street.
My father would have rejoiced to receive the Rajah into his own house, had he possessed fitting accommodation for so illustrious a guest. But his ward, Miss Castle, a young lady of remarkable loveliness and maturity of mind, who resided with her aunt in a commodious mansion in beautiful grounds near Stapleton, felt highly honoured by the privilege of placing her house at his disposal. There he came. There gathered round him the wise and good who were able to obtain access to him. There John Foster, of worldwide celebrity for his unique and original writings, was a frequent domestic visitor. And there, or in his own house, my father saw him daily. How did he win the admiration and respect of all by his noble, princely bearing and his gracious manners? How did I rejoice when it was my privilege to be in his company?
Thanks to Rolinda Sharples, an American portrait artist residing in Bristol at the time, we get a fair idea of the wise and good that surrounded RamMohun in that city. An elaborate courtroom scene that she painted depicts the trial of Colonel Brereton, charged with the ineffective handling of the Bristol riots of 1831. Carla explains its special connection with the Rajah.
Now, the Bristol riots happened in 1831. So when she paints in Rajah RamMohun Roy, that is historical license, he was actually busy in London giving all his evidence to the Privy Council. Rolinda Sharples also, somewhat modestly, paints herself in, busy sketching, and her mother over here. Now, I have a theory that Rolinda Sharples either met or spoke with people who knew the young Rajah Ram, because this boy in the portrait is clearly a teenager. And Rajah Ram, the adopted son of Rajah RamMohun Roy, came to Bristol for holidays to land carpenter. So I think that what is painted here, officially it was supposed to be the Rajah, his adopted father, but it was not. It is a young boy. The clothes are similar to those worn by Rajah RamMohun Roy. The Bengali fixed topi as well is exactly the same. But in fact, it is a portrait of a young boy, and it's misnamed by Rolinda Sharples as Rajah RamMohun Roy. She didn't get her facts right. It is the extreme left-hand corner that is the interesting part of this portrait by Rolinda Sharples. Catherine Castle, RamMohun Roy's hostess at Beach House, then Stapleton Grove. She was a young heiress. I think this is her father, Mr. Castle, who had died just a year or two before RamMohun Roy came to Bristol, and Anne Cadell, who lived with Catherine Castle at Stapleton Grove and was the hostess for Rajah Ram, the young boy, and Rajah RamMohun Roy, his adopted father, and the two Hindu servants from Calcutta. This is the great portrait of Rajah RamMohun Roy, painted in 1831, which currently hangs in the Bristol City Museum and Art Gallery. It was painted by Henry Perronet Briggs, who was a painter with royal patronage, later on Queen Victoria. A first-class painter and a first-class portrait, 1.5 times life size, by the way. This portrait was the subject of a very interesting lecture by Max Muller in 1873 when he opened the museum here. And he took the portrait as the theme of his talk, which was on Rajah RamMohun Roy himself. And the Bristol newspapers of the day recorded that in detail. The portrait itself is, as I said, an allegory. If you look at it, he is holding in his right hand a book. It was traditionally taken to be the Bible. Behind him, on his right, there is a mosque and a Hindu temple. And what the portrait is trying to show in its background is the way in which the Rajah symbolized and joined together in his theistic society, the Brahmo Samaj, the three major religions in India. The two older religions, Hinduism, of course, the oldest of the lot, the imported Muslim Islam, and later on the missionaries who were very busy, the Christian missionaries in Calcutta in Bengal at his time.
Also connected with the memory of RamMohun is Lewins Mead. The Unitarians had chosen this disadvantaged area to uplift it through their humanitarian efforts. The Unitarian meeting house still stands here, transformed into the offices of an IT recruitment firm, Resource Matters. We were lucky to secure the permission to visit and film inside this building, no longer open to the public. Much to their credit, the owners have maintained the pulpit and some other fixtures from the period. However, in private hands, their future is ultimately uncertain.
Here we are in the Unitarian meeting house in the centre of Bristol, Lewins Mead Meeting House. It was originally the meeting house of Lant Carpenter, Mary Carpenter's father, but by the time that the plaques were put up here, those are the two plaques to RamMohun Roy, who preached here, and to Keshab Chandra Sen, who came in the 1870s. Lant Carpenter was dead, and it was the Reverend William James, whose plaque is over there, who was actually the minister in charge. The original pulpit is still here, and it's very interesting because it's a late Regency pulpit with a sounding board at the top of it. And originally the whole of the hall here would have been covered with pews, which people rented, and the two large galleries above, plus, of course, a very large organ at the back where the choir also would have sat. It's a beautiful building, and the windows here are very much the same as the windows in Lant Carpenter's house, which was the official residence of the minister of Lewins Mead meeting. I've always been very interested in this plaque to Rajah RamMohun Roy because it says quite clearly that he actually preached here in the Lewins Mead meeting house. However, I have some doubts about that. I may be proved wrong, but my doubts arise from this. Lant Carpenter himself gave the sermon on the day that Rajah RamMohun Roy came to the service here. The next Sunday, which would have been the next service, unfortunately, Rajah RamMohun Roy had got meningitis and he wasn't able to come. So on the first Sunday, he was actually seated here amongst the congregation, listening to Lant Carpenter, who gave a sermon on a small cloud the size of a man's hand, which is from the Old Testament, of course. And I don't think there would have been any more time for the Rajah to have addressed the congregation. He might possibly have been asked as an illustrious visitor by Lant Carpenter to go up and bow to the congregation or say a couple of words, but I don't think that he actually was asked to preach, which is a shame because I'm sure he would have had a lot very interesting things to say. Incidentally, the three plaques which are here in Lewins Mead Meeting House were put up in the late 1870s, 1880s. It was quite a time after the Rajah died in 1833. Memories may have become a little lost. Mary Carpenter may not have remembered exactly what had happened.
But Mary Carpenter did remember, and her writing upholds Carla's supposition.
On one Sunday only did he join with us in worship in our Lewins Mead chapel. We were very happy to have him there among us. My father had selected for his subject "The Cloud No Bigger Than a Man's Hand," in reference to the progress of Negro emancipation, of which the devoted advocate, Mr. Wilberforce, had just been summoned from his labours. And he felt the text and the tenor of his sermon equally applicable to the hopes we had for India. The occasion was deeply interesting. The melancholy privilege had been given him of following to the grave the champion of the oppressed. Little did he imagine that in a few short weeks he should be called on to offer a similar mark of respect and affection to his illustrious hearer.
Close to the Carpenter residence in what was then 47 Park Street lived another prominent Unitarian friend of RamMohun, the eye surgeon John Bishop Estlin. He had grown up in St. Michael's Hill, Bristol, where his father, John Prior Estlin, ran a school. The Rajah had been communicating with both father and son while still in India. Estlin's daily notes, faithfully reproduced by Miss Carpenter, help us reconstruct the cause of the Rajah's death.
I rode over to Stapleton to see my mother. Found the Rajah ill in fever. He saw me willingly, and I prescribed for him. At 8 the Rajah's carriage came for me. I found him a little better, but still feverish. The Rajah no better. He had a headache coming on, but it subsided on the effect of medicine. He slept in the evening, but with his eyes much open. On awaking about 11, I found his extremities very cold, and his pulse 130 and weak, with the appearance of collapse. Warm liquids and a little wine and external warmth relieved him, but his restlessness, changing from bed to the sofa on the ground, was very great. I begged today that he would allow Miss Hare to attend him constantly. He said it would be very improper. I assured him the customs in this country rendered it quite proper, and she was admitted. I felt very anxious about him tonight, and told my mother I should propose Pritchard's seeing him tomorrow, if he were no better.
Eyes open during sleep would tend to indicate the loss of consciousness. The other symptoms of restlessness, high pulse rate or tachycardia, and cold extremities can be recognized by a modern scholar such as Nripin Bhowmik of Calcutta as a state of shock induced by septicemia. Estlin also notes that the Rajah often seemed to be in a state of prayer during his illness.
The Rajah was very restless till towards the morning, when he slept with his eyes much open. Pritchard came at 11:30. In the evening the Rajah was better, and I was in more spirits about him. He said that if he were to die, he had the satisfaction of knowing he had the best advice in Bristol.
Dr. Estlin also involved other more senior medical practitioners, such as Drs. Pritchard and Carrick, of course to no avail. The head seeming to be the area the most affected, leeches were applied, as was the practice at the time. Also, the Rajah had a lot of hair, as is evident from his portraits, and much or most of it was cut off in the last few days of his life, such that his friends and the doctor could allow for cold compresses to try to control the fever the best way they knew how.
Mr. Hare sat up during most of last night. He reported to me between 3 and 4 a.m. that the Rajah's pulse had sometimes been very weak and rapid, so as to make him feel very solicitous. He was in an imperfect sleep, with the eyes open most of the night. Dr. Carrick came at 11, and before Pritchard arrived we were summoned to the room by Miss Hare, and found him with an attack of spasm, with convulsive twitchings of the mouth. These went on more or less for an hour or two, and he seemed not sensible to our visit, though in the morning when I went to him he smiled at me and squeezed my hand in an affectionate manner. After the spasms subsided he appeared to sleep, the eyes still open, pupils small, the left arm and leg paralysed.
The Rajah was now slipping into a coma, from which he would never recover. This is important for us to remember, as we shall see.
The Rajah became worse every few minutes, his breathing more rattling and impeded, his pulse imperceptible. He moved about his right arm constantly, and his left a little, a few hours before his death. It was a beautiful moonlight night. On one side of the window, as Mr. Hare, Miss Kiddle and I looked out of it, was the calm, rural midnight scene. On the other, this extraordinary man, dying. I shall never forget the moment. His last breath had been drawn at 25 minutes past 2 a.m.
Soon after the Rajah's death, Dr. Estlin oversaw a plaster cast of the Rajah's head, a practice reserved for the most eminent people in Europe of the time. Apart from the esteem that this belied, he probably wanted to save an impression of what he called the Rajah's beautiful, majestic look, before the aggressive post-mortem he had planned. A death mask believed to be a replica is kept in the RamMohun library in Calcutta.
An examination of the body took place on Saturday, when the brain was found to be inflamed, containing some fluid and covered with a kind of purulent effusion. Its membrane also adhered to the skull, the result, probably, of previously existing disease. The thoracic and abdominal viscera were healthy. The case appeared to be one of fever producing great prostration of the vital powers, and accompanied by inflammation of the brain, which did not exhibit, in their usual degree, the symptoms of that affection.
At a time when infectious diseases were not well understood, Estlin had clearly misdiagnosed the cause of the Rajah's death. A modern doctor knows that fever itself is not a disease but a symptom, and the purulent effusion that he saw on the Rajah's brain was not the effect but the cause of the fever. Ripin Bhomik concludes that the case was one of pyogenic meningitis. However, we must be very grateful to Dr. Estlin for having had the foresight to conduct the autopsy when it was not required by the law. Without this we would never know why the Rajah died. His observation that the thoracic viscera were normal rules out tuberculosis, another leading cause of death in the 1830s in the West Country. In later life, Estlin, an eye surgeon, had turned his attention to infectious diseases. To what extent this was motivated by his failure to save RamMohun, we shall never know.
The best medical practitioners did all that human skill could do for him, but unavailingly. The fever gained ground rapidly, and soon the awful news arrived that he was dead. It was like a thunderclap to us. We had seen him in the full strength and prime of manhood. His noble and majestic frame seemed likely to last to a ripe old age. We thought that a long career lay before him. The Heavenly Father knew best how his great work should be accomplished, and summoned this, his faithful labourer, to his rest, that others might enter into his labours. It were useless now to dwell on the grief and perplexity which filled our hearts, on the darkness which seemed to brood over the future of India. Nor will I attempt to record my solemn thoughts when I entered the death chamber, and, placed near those windows whence the living Rajah had so often looked out on our lovely English scenery, I stood by the coffin which contained his mortal remains. The Rajah's illness had been so sudden, and such perfect quiet and freedom from exciting topics had been enjoined as the only chance for recovery, that he had given no directions as to his last wishes. It was known, however, that he adhered to all Brahminical customs, which, in his opinion, did not savour of idolatry. This was not from any value which he attached to them, so much as to avoid all unnecessary cause of offence to his countrymen, which might lessen with them the influence of his writings. 2 Brahmin servants continually attended on him, and after his death they found upon him the thread indicating his caste. The attached friends whose advice and assistance he had often sought in London gave it as their opinion that with these known feelings of his, it would not be right to inter him in an ordinary burying ground. Indeed, he had been heard to express the wish that if he died in England, a spot of ground should be purchased for him where he might lie in peace, and a cottage erected near to protect his resting place from intrusion. They thought, likewise, that there must be no religious worship or rite performed at his interment. In accordance with these views, it was considered best to select a secluded spot in the shrubbery shaded with beautiful trees, and there preparations were made for the last mournful rites. But these arrangements and necessary consultations occupied considerable time, and as much public interest had been excited by the visit of the illustrious stranger and his mournful death, my father decided on paying the respect due to him of a funeral sermon in his chapel without further delay, and it was announced that on the evening of Sunday, October 7th, he would preach on the mournful subject. The chapel yard was thronged some time before the service commenced, and not only was every pew in the edifice densely crowded, but seats in the aisles were speedily filled, and the whole vacant space was closely occupied by people standing. Never before nor since have I beheld such a crowd in that or in any other place of worship. All who knew my father, or who had ever heard him preach, will imagine what feeling, what depth of spirituality was infused into every part of the service. The grand 40th chapter of Isaiah which he read had to me a high significance which it had never had before, and to this day I seldom hear it or read it without thinking of the Rajah. How but a few weeks before we had rejoiced at his long-expected visit to us. We had for many years watched his star in the east, rising in calm, solitary grandeur, the herald, we hoped, of a glorious morn to benighted India. We had seen it pass steadfastly on its heavenly way, through the midst of dark clouds, and even through fierce storms of persecution, and finally rising above them.
This is the original burial place of Rajah RamMohun Roy. He died on the first floor of Beach House, which is literally 200 feet away. He, at the time, in 1833, there was a group of trees here, elm trees, and it was a very quiet, secluded place in the grounds of the castle house. His last 2 days were spent pretty well in unconsciousness. But when he died, he was wearing his sacred thread. His two servants, his two Brahmin servants, one Brahmin, the Brahmin cook, and another servant were with him, and of course his adopted son, Rajah Ram. It took quite a long time for the burial to take place. He died on the 27th of September, and he wasn't buried until mid-October, almost a month later. But this is the place where the burial took place, in silence, with no ceremony, no Christian hymns, nothing overtly religious at all. The Rajah himself had hoped that he would be buried, if he died outside India, in a quiet place without any ceremony, and a small house might be erected with a caretaker to live in it to tend his grave. That isn't exactly what happened. He was buried here in Miss Castle's family home, the grounds, and there was no house. But in the event, he didn't stay here very long.
There was an article by a group of westernized students of the Hindu college, known as the Young Bengal. In that article, they stated that a memorial monument for Rajah RamMohun Roy should be built in Bristol. The interesting thing about the whole affair is that originally this group of students dismissed RamMohun as half-liberal, but eventually they realized that RamMohun was a great social pioneer and should be celebrated. So they wrote this article saying that there should be a monument, and they also raised some fund towards the expenses. So when they got to know that Dwarkanath was coming, they met him and gave him the money and entrusted him with the task of building this mausoleum.
So the Rajah was here or just less than 10 years.
Much has been made of the fact that the Rajah's sacred thread was found on him after his death. While the Unitarians were anxious to claim him as one of their converts and were somewhat disappointed, Hindus have seen this as evidence that RamMohun ultimately chose to die a Brahmin. This painting of unknown authorship from Calcutta, no doubt executed with great love and reverence, shows an artist's impression of Dr. Estlin by the bedside, with presumably Janet Hare holding an Om sign. It is, however, an exercise in wishful thinking that seeks to bolster the Raja's Hindu credentials. The truth is probably closer to what he told Bishop Middleton in Calcutta, that he did not prefer one set of superstitions over another. A careful review of the burial document shows that the Brahmin servant Ramrathan Mukherjee was able to sign his name in Bengali and English. In fact, he obviously also signed for Ramhari Das. This was no ordinary domestic servant in the 1830s.
Ramrathan was in fact a distant and impoverished relative of RamMohun, possibly hand-picked by the family to keep his master's dietary and religious experimentation on a short tether. Eslin's diary indicates that Ramrathan was in charge after the Raja's death. He would have had ample opportunity to put the sacred thread on the Raja following his death. Already we have seen evidence that the Raja was slipping into a coma days before his death, making it unlikely that he consciously asked for the thread. Dr. Eslin also assisted him to a bath 2 days before his death and did not mention seeing the thread indicating his caste, as Mary Carpenter put it. On the eve of his return to India, Ramrathan was confronted by Susanna Eslin, Dr. Eslin's mother, for having told someone that the Raja had prayed to 364 gods. Ramrathan vigorously denied the charge, but it seems to suggest that he was stage managing the last hours of the Raja's life, telling everyone what they wanted to hear. The sacred thread, if it was his discreet touch, would almost surely be rewarded by the family in India.
Who would have thought that the Bristol pilgrimage would bring me to Edinburgh? Ever since I saw the replica death mask in Calcutta, I wanted to see the original. Carla had established the fact that it had ended up in Edinburgh, possibly at the medical school.
When I called around all the likely places, no one had heard of RamMohun Roy or his death mask.
It was the modern marvel of the internet that finally came to my aid. By doing various searches with RamMohun and death mask, I was finally able to locate a site that was selling replica death masks for £250 to £450, literally per head. Amazingly enough, a replica of RamMohun Roy's death mask was also on this online catalogue. The site, belonging to the William Ramsay Henderson Trust, named Professor Matthew Kaufman as its contact. After several attempts, on the 27th of April 2004, an email from Professor Kaufman, University of Edinburgh Medical School, confirmed that the death mask was indeed in their possession, but on permanent loan to a storage facility of the Scottish National Portrait Gallery in Granton. An email from its custodians confirmed that the original death mask with the reference number and Rai, spelled Punjabi style with an I, was at the Granton facility. It took 6 months of negotiations via email and phone calls to secure the permission to see and film the mask, not in public view since 1886. Next morning, I arrived early in the desolate area near the waterfront. The impressively named Granton Art Centre was in fact only a storage facility. There are no exhibitions and it is not open to the public. As I wondered where I could get some coffee, my main contact person arrived.
Yes, you can.
Alan Barkis, a former policeman with a soft corner for the arts, looks after this facility. He was the person who 6 months ago had confirmed for me on the phone that the original plaster cast was indeed there. He had made the special visit on a Saturday with his wife when the facility was closed, just to help me out.
This death mask is not normally on display. I don't know if Anne will explain that to you, would you?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Alan had taken the trouble to bring out the mask from the shelves to put it on display for filming from different angles. Finally, there it was, an exact image in 3 dimensions of this giant of the Indian Renaissance, within hours of his death 171 years ago. Even if photography had been invented by then, there would be no way to get such a complete picture of the Rajah's appearance, but for this simple measure that belied the remarkable foresight of Dr. Estlin. It became apparent that the Calcutta Mosque was not a replica after all. The original showed somewhat smaller and asymmetric ears. It also seemed smaller in size, normal for a Bengali gentleman about 6 feet tall today, but perhaps big in volume for the period as reported in contemporary accounts. It seemed somewhat elongated from the side, as casts from the front and the back seemed to be imperfectly joined together. The study of the shape and protuberances of the head, called Phrenology, was popular in Scotland at the time. It was believed to reveal character and mental capacity. The Rajah's head was charted and studied in great detail, very likely by noted phrenologists Gall and Combe, themselves immortalized by their own death masks. His head was believed to reveal traits of firmness, conscientiousness, self-esteem and love of approbation. The last quality was believed to explain his chief flaw, which was his inability to say no, an Asian trait of acquiescence that sometimes put him in an awkward corner. Even there, Lant Carpenter rose vehemently to his defense, explaining that that was part of his indulgent Eastern etiquette, and that no man stood more firmly in the face of adversity than the Rajah when the situation truly demanded it. The phrenologists also found traits of secretiveness, combativeness, benevolence and pessimism in him that they sought to reconcile with his life, and the attempt seems at once quaint and interesting, if not entertaining. His lack of veneration and wonder was believed to be the reason why he placed so little stock in the tales of miracle of any faith, and valued logical thinking above all else. Even though phrenology is now discredited as a science, the death mask of RamMohun, commissioned by his friends, belies the esteem they had for him and his deeds. The company he keeps in this extraordinary shrine speaks for itself. Samuel Johnson, Jonathan Swift, William Wordsworth, Walter Scott, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, Franz Joseph Haydn, Isaac Newton, as well as his friends in his mortal life, Jeremy Bentham, with whom he corresponded extensively, and William Roscoe. The anguish of the last breath drawn, sometimes still written on their faces. The Rajah, by contrast, looks peaceful and recognizable from the Perrine Briggs portrait. The Peel portrait, showing a stout face, however, seems a poor likeness, unless it was commenced at a time when the Rajah had put on weight, as reported by the Sanskrit scholar Wilson. Dr. Estlin did not record a rapid weight loss during his last illness. From the Edinburgh Castle that evening, while enjoying a panoramic view of the waterfront, called the Firth of Forth, where Granton is located, I bade goodbye to the death mask in its abode of quiet Scottish hospitality for nearly 2 centuries.
There's the Rajah. Let's go and say hello to him. And here is the great statue of Rajah RamMohun Roy. And to my delight, when we came here this afternoon, I found once again somebody had left a flower, a rose. Very often I've come to see the statue here in Bristol, and people have left a bouquet, sometimes a garland, sometimes a single rose as it is today. I think that is very touching, and it shows how much alive the Rajah is still in public perception.
Live in public perception perhaps, but not always in a positive way. The plaque dedicated to Indian independence, however suitable or well-meaning, does nothing to explain the Rajah's connection with Bristol to the passer-by. Consequently, the statue has been controversial. Many believe that the statue of native Bristolian Archibald Leach, better known as Cary Grant, should take the spot occupied by the Rajah in the city's prominent College Green area. Debate has raged in the main newspaper, the Bristol Evening Post. One reader has argued that the statue be moved to one of the city's Asian enclaves. Another has compared its placement to the whims of the Stalinist Soviet Union trying to rewrite history with public funds. Asks one reader mockingly, "I came here 30 years ago and have provided work for several surgeons, window cleaners, refuse collectors, and so on. Can I please have a statue?" Repeatedly, Carla Contractor has risen to the statue's defence.
Some people have actually asked why the statue was here instead of Cary Grant, who was of course a Bristolian originally, and there's been some acrimonious debate in the pages of our local newspaper, the Evening Post, Bristol Evening Post, in which several people wrote and said, "Why isn't Cary Grant here?" Well, I had much joy in answering it. This is an international figure. Rajah RamMohun Roy, in our multicultural days, stands for the joining together of faiths, the understanding of Hindu for Muslim, Muslim for Hindu, Christian for Muslim and Hindu, and vice versa. The fact that he stood for the joining together of religions and peace and understanding with his Brahma Samaj. And it forms the backdrop to the statue behind it of Queen Victoria. When it was initially put up, I used to call it The Empire Strikes Back, but that's perhaps just an ill-placed joke. It's looking west because the Rajah was going down first to stay with his old mentor, Woodford, just outside Exeter, and then he hoped to go on and visit the Unitarians over the sea in America. Because here it is in the very heart of historic Bristol. The City Hall is on my right, the main library, a beautiful building on our left, and the cathedral, the Anglican cathedral behind me. It's a prime spot. I think that the city planners and the city council wanted to give importance, multicultural importance perhaps, for our day. And Cary Grant is an important person, and the Evening Post wrote this, printed this letter in which the writer wanted to know why Cary Grant didn't have this spot, and who was the Rajah anyway, and what did he do for Bristol. I don't think that you need to answer what did he do for Bristol, because I think a city as important as Bristol needs to celebrate its internationality. The people who have come, the people who have lent lustre to this city, such as the Rajah. So I replied to this newspaper article and I pointed out that one of our main statues here in Bristol is to Neptune, down on the centre. And what has Neptune personally done for Bristol? However, the answer is an international visitor such as the Rajah should be celebrated nationally in India and internationally here in Britain.
আদি অন্ত নাহি যারো যেরো ছিল এ সংসার আদি অন্ত নাহি জানো সে জানে সকল কেহ নাহি জানে তাকে